they're doing that. We had a debate, a exchange with Professor José van Dijk and Professor Bart Jacobs on the need for more public digital space. There were panels about autonomy. I see that I am loud and clear. That's good to hear. It's always nice to be loud and clear. I'm hoping that most people who have had the intention of joining have joined. If not, we can always see them tagging along later. So with me today, as was yesterday, is Professor Sally Wyatt of Digital Cultures of the University of Maastricht. Sally, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here again.
Yeah, good to be here again. That you're here again, sorry. I was wondering, what did you take away from yesterday?
Well, yesterday it was wonderful. And even in these kind of somewhat strange circumstances, I think it worked really, really well. I think all the different sessions really demonstrated what we're trying to do with the Digital Society program, a kind of very interdisciplinary approach to the problems and challenges that digitalization is raising, and a collaborative approach. So we saw lots of instances of how people are working together across disciplines and universities, but also with industry, with political partners, with civil society organizations. So that was really, really nice to see.
Yeah, it's exactly what the program's about, as you mentioned. Yeah. What are we going to hear today?
Well, lots of interesting things again. I think yesterday there was perhaps a bit more emphasis on the kind of production and the making and the regulation of digital technologies. I think later this afternoon we'll hear more about kind of users and citizens and participants and patients and all of us in our different roles, how we interact or not. I mean, there's a nice session coming up later about social inclusion, and because there's sometimes, especially in a rich country like the Netherlands, and everybody's already digital and online, but that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of people who have challenges in different sorts of ways, so that we'll hear more about that. And in just a couple of minutes, we'll be hearing from Professor Bell from Australia, who's doing something I think really important. I mean, it's very easy when we're talking about digitalization, because, every day there's 5 things in the news about what's happening, and you're trying to keep up, and it's really hard to keep up. But all these technologies, all our uses of these technologies have quite a long history. And I think sometimes it's always really important to look at history, also to try and understand the future, what alternatives there might be. We went down particular roads with the technology, but there were other ways of doing things, and maybe we need to relook at those to think about alternatives.
Yeah, thank you so much. As Sally mentioned, we'll be hearing from Professor Genevieve Bell. She is the director of the School of Cybernetics in Australia. And she got her PhD in cultural anthropology at Stanford, and she worked in the field for years for the company Intel in Asia. So she knows both the academic world and also the world of engineers from quite a close distance. We're very honored that she's here on the other part of the world. It's evening where she is. So hi, Ms. Bell. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's absolutely my pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Well, please take it away with your keynote.
Excellent. So now we're going to do that piece of magic where I push a button and we hope everything works. It's my favorite bit of magic. Just like this. Actually, I'm going to press 3 buttons, as it turns out.
There we go. That's the magic. Thank you so much.
Excellent. So same rules apply. Please put in the chat if I'm talking too quickly, if I'm not clear, if there's any sort of more things I can do to be helpful here. As Sally said, what I really wanted to do over the next 30 minutes was reflect on how we came to be in this moment, and to reflect on the history of our future and the kind of ways in which our current technologies have a longer past, and some of the unexpected pieces of that. Because I think in doing that, it's less for me about does it give us answers, but I think it primes better questions. So think of this less as a talk and more perhaps as a meditation on the sort of state of the digital world in which we find ourselves. As was said, I am coming to you from Australia, and one of the things that we like to do when we start our conversations in Australia is acknowledge where we are. So I want to acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people today in Canberra, Australia, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present of this piece of country, and to acknowledge that this is land that was always sacred and was never ceded, and that there is something that is both an extraordinary pleasure and a privilege to get to talk about the future and about the role of technology in that future in a place where people have been building the future for 60,000 years. I also want to acknowledge that this talk is going out across airwaves in many, many, many different places, and I imagine that there are traditional owners and elders in those places too, and I want to pay my respects there as well. So that should also make a couple of other things clear. I'm not your usual person to be talking about technology, and I believe that it has both a country and a history, and that those countries and histories are hugely important to acknowledge. So one way I often think about this is, well, where would you start? Where do you start with the history of the future? Where do you start with the history of the digital? Like, where does it begin? And there's lots of places it might begin. I think you could start in 4 different places. You could start in Bletchley Park in England. You could start in Philadelphia in the United States. You could start in Manchester, again back in the United Kingdom, or you could start in Sydney here in Australia. And in all of those places, over less than a 5-year period, the very first computers, the precursors of the things we recognize today, were switched on. And whilst we would call them computers, and in doing, we erased that term as meaning a person who did maths, or more specifically, a woman who did maths, and we replaced it with a technological object. We call them computers, but it's probably a bit of a misnomer. Those first machines were immense. They were the size of multiple shipping containers together. They were loud. They smelt. Sort of strange to think that computers had a smell, but all those early computers smelt because they were running an incredible amount of energy through a relatively small space, through relatively fragile instruments, and the instruments used to catch on fire and burn, and bugs would get there and dust would get there, and the early people who ran those machines knew that they were functioning well by the way they smelt and the way they sounded. Computing was a sensorial activity. Those systems were also incredibly intensive in their use of energy. So both the Enigma machine at Bletchley Park and the ENIAC, which is truthfully really the very first thing we would recognize as a computer that turned on in Philadelphia in 45, in order to do really simple calculations, so adding and subtracting, the thing was 3 shipping containers big, and it took the power of 6 suburbs to do basic arithmetic. They used to joke in Philadelphia in 1945, 46 that you knew they were computing at the naval base because the electric light in your kitchen would flicker. It was so much energy to do such a simple task. And I'm always struck when we talk about the past of computing that one of the things we don't reflect about is just how complicated these things were in terms of their relationships to power, not social power in this case, but actually the electrical kind that ran out of the grid, as well as to the materiality that was needed to build them. The first computer in Australia used mercury that had to be heated to 40 degrees Celsius in order to function well, which meant that every time a transistor or a cylinder broke, you had to clear out the building because there was poison running through it. And so there's something about this early history where, yes, they were computers, but they were also material objects. And they were material objects that bound together ideas about people and what we were willing to tolerate in terms of danger and labor. And so we can say that our digital world started there. So it started with large, heaving, loud, smelly, intensive systems. And I'm sure for some of the people who were there in those moments, they wondered if this was all computing was going to be. Because these machines were indeed also fragile and temperamental. And in the case of Australia, because they had to be heated to a certain temperature and air conditioning didn't exist in the 1940s and 1950s, computing in Australia was a winter activity. You couldn't do computing in the summer because the ambient air temperature was the same as the mercury acoustic delay lines, and so they ceased to function. So thinking about these as temperamental, fragile objects is a very different way than thinking about the way we imagine computing today. So you could start there. You could start with these incredible material embodied objects and the amount of money it cost and who produced that money. You could move forward very quickly and say, well, within 10 years of turning on those first machines, we already had gone from a thing that was 3 shipping containers to something that was the size of a large old metal desk from a government department. Taller, still accountable, which would be the first mainframes. And for many of the people working in places like IBM in the United States and Bell Telephone and their laboratories, there was a kind of remarkable enthusiasm about the fact that they had gone from being 3 shipping containers and 6 suburbs worth of power to now, big, but nowhere near that big. And they were more strategic. They started to have operating languages. They were easier to manage and control. They were nowhere near as temperamental. You could scale them up. And if that's your first 10 years, you start to ask yourself, what will the next 10 be like? And for a collection of industrial people who were sitting inside large companies building computation, they wanted to speculate wildly about what that future would look like. And in 1955, 2 of those men in particular, a man named Nathaniel Rochester, who was the chief architect for the mainframe lines at IBM, and Claude Shannon, who is well known for his role as an information architect at Bell Labs and for creating the idea of information theory, got together and went, right, what is the future of computing going to look like? And more to the point, how are we going to tell ourselves, the market, and the world about what we can do with all this computing? And how are we going to convince people to keep investing in making these computers better? And oh, by the way, how are we going to use computing to tackle what we think are the existential kind of challenges of the moment? And so 2 industrial players find 2 university postdocs and collectively between them put together a research proposal and send it to the Rockefeller Foundation and say, please fund our research. We know about all of this because a year after that first research request went in, a conference happened at Dartmouth College in New England in the United States. And that conference created the term artificial intelligence and the research agenda that sits underneath of it. And that research agenda was boldly put what's on the screen here, where they said that the study was to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. Which is to say, they believed that they could work out what made intelligence, they could break it down into its very small pieces, and they could instrument each one of those pieces. They went on to further say that they thought there were 4 things that were going to be really important there. Make machines use language, so speech. Make machines form abstractions and concepts, as in get beyond words to meaning and strategy. Solve the kinds of problems now reserved for humans, and improve themselves. Unsurprisingly, that should be somewhat familiar because that is in some ways still the AI research agenda. But back in 1956, it wasn't a technology. It was about, it was about a research agenda. It was about creating a pathway by which you would continue to support the growth of computation inside large American companies. It was a conference funded by the United States defense apparatus who were interested in what machines might be like if they could do these things. And that constellation of where the money comes from, what the prevailing interests were, what the relationships were between government and industry and the academy has been, in this particular space, complicated since before the project even started. So complicated from before the first day they gathered, complicated by the nature of the research proposal they submitted, which delightfully did have the line in it that it was going to be a 2-month, 10-man study. And they were true to their word. Not a lot of women in that conversation. You could look at a different place and go, well, 10 years after that moment, there was another moment where our digital world kind of snaps into focus. And it's in San Francisco in December of 1968 with a man named Doug Engelbart, who decides he is going to demo an online system he has been working in that's about natural language interfaces, that is about bringing together all these pieces of the puzzle he thought were necessary. For him, that involved a thing that looks remarkably like a mouse, the idea of cutting and pasting text, file structures, hyperlinking, the internet, and all the motives for using it. And to his credit, he does this as this mad real-time demo. He figured, why not? You're not going to talk about it, I'm going to show it. If you've never watched the video that is still in existence of this demo, it is a worthy use of 90 minutes of your time. If you just look up Engelbart and the mother of all demos, you will find it. And you will find the precursor of every tech CEO who ever stood on a stage showing off their technology in the last 20 years owes that world to Engelbart, both in performative nature, but also in content. It's a remarkable moment too, because of who was in the room and because of the story that was being told and because of the narrative that goes around the technology, which is to start suggesting yet again and re-embroidering these notions about productivity, ideas about the relationship between the user and how the technology is conceived, stitching together the home world and the industrial world. All those things come through in this demo. It's also an attempt to start yet again telling a story about the technology that, rather than the AI one, which has the human as a thing you can abstract out from, this has very much got the human in the center, controlling this technical apparatus and attempting to get things done. You see another version of that story in London, same year, with an exhibit that brought together people that were using computational technology to make art. So rather than it being about productivity or about military usages, here it's about how might computation reveal and make serendipity and splendor and wonder. How might the digital create poetry, create graphic art? How might it make music? How might it create moments of utter transformation? And there's an exhibit that happens in London in '68 in the Design Museum there called Cybernetics Serendipity, which brings together a series of digital artists whose work we would now know, but who were relatively unknown then, and creates an entirely different unfolding set of possibilities of where computing might go. And again, here it's very much about the relationships through and between the human and the technical. So it's not abstract up to a computer, it's about stitching those things together and about the relationships that might unfold. And of course, then there is the moment that many of us might remember of a different starting of this particular world, the world that makes it possible for me to be sitting in Canberra, Australia, talking to you on the other side of the world, which is that on October 1969, two computer terminals spoke to each other across a phone line and created the beginning of the backbone of the internet. And here it was about stitching together technologies across large distances to bring together both information and context. And of course, we know this as the internet. If you don't know the story of the first day of trying to connect the internet, it is a delightful one because they try to connect them to machines. They get halfway through, crash the system, and it takes another 6 weeks to get it back up and running again, which in the context of the ways we have been dependent on technology during the pandemic might feel vaguely familiar. So lots of different stories, right? Unfolding over what is only a 20-year period. But here's the piece that I find really interesting. Sitting underneath all of these stories, there's a different story, and one we talk a lot less about, but I think is equally generative, which is the story of a different conversation that happened in the same time period. A story of technology that brings together, or a story of thinking about technology that brings together voices as disparate as Gregory Bateson, Margaret Mead, and David Bowie, along with Sergey Brin and Larry Page, and even sometimes Elon Musk, though I try not to tell him about that. And that conversation is something called cybernetics. So I'm interested here in cybernetics as both theory and praxis. I'm interested in cybernetics as it was constituted and how it is utilized to produce all of those other moments in our digital world. So as a theoretical intervention, as a theory, cybernetics finds its most recent instantiations in the 1940s, immediately after World War II, by the very same people that were building those computers. So John von Neumann, who's the architect of the ENIAC, Norbert Wiener, who was at MIT thinking about the future of computing. The very same people who were building computers were worrying about what people were going to do with them. And throughout the 1940s and the early 1950s, they constituted a series of conversations, mostly in New York, about how to think about our futures with these machines. And for them, those conversations were trying to do a couple of different things. They wanted to make clear that you couldn't build technical systems and imagine they would be neutral. Because after all, this is a collection of people who have watched what happened with technology during World War II and are acutely aware of the role of computation in aiming guns in particular, and also arraying military hardware. And so for that whole collection of thinkers and doers, one of their strong points of view was that whatever technology should look like going forward, it shouldn't get to be able to enact by itself absent human control and absent, in some ways, a moral agenda. And that moral agenda was one about saying we shouldn't actually kill people. We probably don't want to, engage in brute force destruction. And oh, by the way, we might need to develop a language and a theory about how we control those systems and how we communicate through them. And cybernetics became that theory. Now, it's had lots of other voices and interpretations over the years, but the pieces about it that are really important are relatively straightforward. One of them is that cybernetics has at its core a notion of feedback. Feedback is a devastatingly simple idea. The output of a system will be its future input. Now, the idea of feedback predates computing, but by the time you get to computing and you start to think about what artificial intelligence systems will be, the notion that the output is the future input starts to let you see how a system might work and how ideas of feedback might become hugely important. Cybernetics also has at its core a notion of circular causality, which is that sitting inside any system where you have the output as the input, you also have a reciprocal relationship between the parts. Now, it's 11:30 at night here in Australia, and that sounds like a lot to digest. I imagine it's a lot to digest there too. So the way to think about this is to say what cybernetics imagined was that computation and humans were going to be a system together, and that system would hold humans and computation in a reciprocal, circular feedback loop. And that what you couldn't and shouldn't do was just have the technology running over here, absent the human beings. Over time, this group of people also came to realize that that set of relationships, that set of reciprocities, shouldn't just be about the human and the technical, it needed to be about the ecological too. Increasingly, they started to think about the environmental world around them. They worried about issues about everything from the biosphere to the Anthropocene. They didn't use those words, but they spent a lot of time worrying about animals and water and the earth and about how you imagined the future as a combination of those three things: the technical, the human, and the ecological. And that what you were interested in was working out how those things threaded together. The other thing that I've mentioned it here that I think is hugely important about all of this conversation about cybernetics was that they were incredibly clear as a collection of thinkers. And here we're talking about in the early 1940s and 50s, this was a conversation between people like Claude Shannon. Heard his name before, right? Interesting. Claude is in this conversation. John von Neumann, Norbert Wiener, Gregory Bateson, Margaret Mead, Jerome Wisner, who would go on to run the NSF, but at that point was the president of MIT, a series of philosophers at Yale and Harvard, and a series of biologists and psychologists from all over the world. And as they sort of nutted out what cybernetics would be, one of the things they were really clear about was that technology wasn't neutral. That as we thought about building systems that had technology at their core, we needed to be aware that those systems embodied a politic. And here I don't mean a right or left, I mean a politic in the sense of it had a point of view. And that as a way of thinking about how you built systems, you wanted to be really clear about that. You wanted to explicate that point of view so that you weren't attempting to do a sleight of hand that went, oh, it's just the technology, because you have the humans there, you have the ecological there, you've already got a point of view because you've said those things need to be related to one another, but you also want to have a point of view about where it's all going. So if those are the kind of the theoretical pieces, and I'm not doing a great service to cybernetics here, any cybernetician is going to just crawl out of their skin. But if those are the core theoretical pieces, there's a couple of praxis pieces that I think are hugely important too. One of them is about the notion that one of the things that made cybernetics extraordinary was that it was iterative. So it took 10 years for them to have the series of conversations that got them to what it might be. And they understood that they needed to build a shared space together. So the early practitioners came from mathematics and philosophy and linguistics and electrical engineering and anthropology and Freudian psychoanalysis and art. And it turns out when you bring all those people together, it's really hard to find common ground. It's really hard to find a common vocabulary, let alone a common approach. And they argued a lot, and they were okay with that. And they were okay with the fact that it was going to take days and weeks and months, sometimes even years, to unfold a shared viewpoint. And they committed to it. They committed to the fact that the conversation would take time. and that over time their ideas would scale and grow and change. The second thing they committed to was that this notion of, basically we would now call it radical interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity or multiple disciplinarity. I've come to think of it more as productive discomfort, that what they were actually investing in collectively and what it is required in my mind to do in order to build kind of these complex systems effectively is that you actually have to invest in having different voices in the room, and that those voices will feel weird and discordant. And it will require different forms of leadership and different forms of moderation and different forms of curation. And how it is that we successfully manage organizations that have this productive discomfort in it, where we are holding people in conversation, even though that conversation is hard, is a very different way of thinking about how to manage organizations and also in some ways how to do things. And last but by no means least, in the kind of cybernetic praxis piece that I find really interesting, are two concepts it's odd to talk about in the context of building complex systems that involve computation, which is ideas about strength and grace. And here I don't mean strength in the sense of a secure cyber system. I mean strength in some ways in the notion of moral strength and grace. And by this, I mean one of the other things that is really striking about the intellectual histories of cybernetics is that the proponents of this area of inquiry understood that they were building something that would be iteratively communicated and that it would change over time. And they hoped that their ideas would hold enough form that you could see the through line, but not so much that they couldn't be taken into other places and other spaces and have something generative done with them. So I sometimes joke at this point that if you scratch the surface of anything interesting in the 20th century, well, second half of the 20th century, you find cybernetics. So whether that's art, music, computation, a whole bunch of other things, there's endless versions of it here. And for me, and I'm always up for shameless self-promotion. This is exactly right. But for me, what's interesting here is we're not just talking about, so cybernetics has a genealogical way it talks about itself: first order, second order, third order cybernetics. I also think there's a cybernetic diaspora that spreads out to include a whole lot of people who are influenced by cybernetics but don't often think about themselves as cyberneticians. And this is where you see the cybernetic worldview influencing the deep ecology movement on the west coast of the United States. American anthropology is profoundly shaped by it in the second half of the 20th century, as is design thinking at Stanford, and most of the companies that started out of the Systems and Symbols program at Stanford come through a cybernetic lens. But for me, there's something really interesting about the notion of how you create ideas that can hold their form but not exclude the possibility of multiple reinterpretations and reinventions. And that feels like an interesting and, for me, productive challenge. And so let me sort of end where I started, which was to say I'm on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land here in Canberra, Australia. I also find myself in the extraordinarily strange position of being the inaugural director of a brand new school of cybernetics here at the Australian National University. So the Australian National University is the only university in Australia funded by the federal government. Was started at the very same time that the cybernetics conversations were unfolding in New York City, so 1946, 1947. It was started with the same notion of having a politic about building things in the post-war period. And it's an interesting place to be as a result of that. But they haven't built a new school here in 30 years. So there's no generational memory of how to do it. And so in January of this year, when we said, we should start a new school, we should start a school of cybernetics, everyone went, okay, we don't even know how to do that. And so we're building the first new school at the university in 30 years. It's the first school of cybernetics, as far as I can tell, in Australia. And I think it is probably the first new school of cybernetics in a couple of generations globally. I'm willing to put money on the fact that it's the first school run by a woman and an anthropologist. And happily, for me at least, in my intellectual genealogy, there are cyberneticians masquerading as cultural anthropologists. So I at least have an intellectual genealogy that takes me back into this conversation. For us, what that's meant here is that we are trying to bring an entire new body of work into existence the only way I know how, which is to build it, right? And build it in 3 different ways. We have created an educational program here that's actually been going on. It predates the school. And it's a interdisciplinary program designed to try and establish a new branch of engineering to take AI safely, sustainably, and responsibly to scale, with a cohort-based education model that's kind of crazy. We've been trying to research this new area into existence, so looking at systems that are cybernetic, which includes indigenous ones here, so building on 60,000 years of indigenous knowledge seems like a good idea, as well as looking at systems that wouldn't think about themselves as cybernetic but clearly are. And then we've been trying to sort of theorize our way into existence too. So what does it mean to talk about cybernetics in the 21st century? What does it mean to talk about it in a particular place, which would be here in Australia? And what does it mean to talk about it with a new vocabulary, acutely aware that some of the pieces of the puzzle in our entire digital history are pieces that are only just now coming back into sharp relief? Ideas about sustainability, ideas about environmental footprints, ideas about how we think about the role of ecology inside all of these conversations. And so on the third floor of a building, also built in a critical year in the history of technology, it's 1968 building that we have, we've brought together about 40 people now, with backgrounds in everything from nuclear physics to photojournalism. We have a couple of student cohorts, and we're trying to work out how to make something new. Because I think the thing I take also from the history of the ways people have imagined the future is that you have to do two pieces of work, right? You have to tell stories about a future that is different than the present. And for me, those stories should talk about a future that is more fair, more equitable, and more just, and more sustainable. And then you have to simultaneously disrupt the present in order to make those futures more than just stories. And so we're trying to do all of that here. So all of that is to say, should any of that seem in the slightest bit interesting to you, or you want to engage in more shameless self-promotion, I'm always happy to help. So one of the things that I also learned in my time in Silicon Valley, which feels like an eternity ago and an eternity long, was that all the stories we tell about technology are frequently stories about lone inventors and single iconoclastic people, often men, are engaged in some kind of Joseph Campbell hero's journey. And the reality is never that. The reality is messier and much more wonderfully collaborative and collective. And so I know we can't build this thing alone, and I don't want to. So my request is that if a piece of this resonates, or you think of someone who should be in a conversation with us, will you send them our way? Because we need all the help and all the companionship and all the productive discomfort we can handle. So with that, I'm going to stop and say thank you.
Ms. Bell, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. I've learned so much. I just want to repeat to all the people who also watch this, if you have a question, put it in the chat box and I can then perhaps read it out, or we can handle it any other way until we can even put you in the live stream. There is a question. There are questions coming in. That's great.
Yes, it's the answer to that.
We have a question. Yeah, can you share experiences? Yeah, I'm just going to read it out for those who hadn't read it. Could you perhaps share some experiences on how to bring in and shape sometimes hard conversations between people with different backgrounds and how you educate your students? Do you have advice for how to bring this into our disciplinary computer science degrees?
Oh gosh, that's such a good question, Berna. And for us, we really thought about it long and hard about how we do that. So some of the answers I would give you are strictly pragmatic, and then some of them are a bit more epistemological, I guess, or pedagogical. So one of the things we did when we first started to bring people together was that we tried multiple versions of, when you first come together, you don't get to announce yourself using a disciplinary shorthand. So I'm willing to bet you've been at an event where someone comes up to you, says their name, and then tells you their department, and you immediately go, "Oh, you're an economist." I know what I think about that. And so we went to a period of time where you could only introduce yourself by your first name and by something that didn't have to do with your disciplinary background. And we went through a period with our students where for the first couple of days, they know each other by a whole series of other things, not their intellectual histories, to give them a little bit of room to find themselves as things other than the shorthand. That's, has varying degrees of success, and they get really frustrated with it, but it's been useful. One of the other things we did was work really hard to find, when we brought our students together, a couple of pedagogical moments where they're all not on a level playing field, but similarly discomforted. So one of the things we've ended up settling on in what we have as our first orientation week. So we do a couple of things in that first orientation week. We take people on country. So the traditional elders of the place we live in work quite closely with us. And so one of the traditional elders takes people onto country here and talks about his people and how they've lived in this land for 20,000 years. And he shows people some of the important sites around this town. So ground them very much in this place. And then sort of from the sublime to the embroidery, we bring them into our lab and basically give everyone an embroidery hoop. So the kind that your grandmother might have had, the birch hoop with the screw in it and a piece of cloth. And we give everyone conductive thread. So the kind that lights up, the kinds that, you know, holds electricity, and a battery and an LED bulb and a needle, and say, now make a circuit. What has been really good there is the ones who know, and it's a terrible generalization, but the people who know how to use an embroidery hoop and a needle and thread and like fabric tend not to be the people who are making circuits. And the people who are making circuits tend to have no idea what an embroidery hoop is. And the lovely thing about it is that between a group of people, all of those skills exist and they all end up helping each other and discovering that all of them have different kinds of skills and all of those skills are necessary to complete the assignment. And so one of the things we've started to try and do there is to think about working through how to let people see their skills as different and collectively more interesting when they are together than when they are apart. But it also means we've had to invest in getting people to trust each other and getting people to have shared experiences of the readings and to work through their discomforts. And it's meant that I think for my staff, they've also had to work really hard at being okay about not knowing everything and of holding people in hard conversations. But it's an iterative process. I think the only other thing I would say is also about how we thought about who we recruited into our student cohort. So at this point, we're 4 cohorts in our master's program and 3 in our PhD program. And I'm happy to report we've been almost 50% female the entire way through. And we've had Indigenous students as well. So we've been trying to work out how to have something that feels a bit more representative.
Yeah. That's great. Thanks. I'm going to forever in my life remember the example you gave of the electricity and the thread and the needle, because I never thought about that. Thank you. There's another fascinating question by Brecht Lammeris, who says, what do you think of Michael Pollan's hypotheses that ideas on cybernetics and connectivity, etc., were pushed by the use of LSD in Silicon Valley?
Well, insofar as many of the same people are in the same conversations, this is a good question. So you actually have to roll the tape back a little bit and go back to a series of conversations that happened during the war, again in New York, about consciousness and the brain, and about some of the people that were in those conversations, including McCulloch, who goes on to be really interested in notions about mind and mind control in the American intelligence services right after the war. And to a period of time when LSD was considered to be an experimental drug regime being used for scientific discovery, which is certainly true in the 40s and 50s and 60s. By the time you have cybernetics turning up on the west coast of the United States, it's come to that coast through people like Gregory Bateson, so applied anthropologist, but Bateson was particularly interested in psychology and the psychological frame. Spent a lot of time in the VA, so the Veterans Administration hospital, treating patients and treating former war veterans, former soldiers, and working through their various kinds of post-war trauma. In that same time period, on the West Coast, you have people like Ken Casey and the Merry Pranksters. You have Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth Catalog. You have a whole collection of people who were all in various different ways wanting to think about ideas about consciousness, ideas about the body, ideas about the mind, ideas about the planet and the ecological. And there was an extraordinary, I think in some ways, openness to conversations that spanned from LSD through to ideas about Buddhism and religion and shamanism. And it was a heady kind of complicated mix. But, you know, insofar as it is pretty clear that a number of people that were instrumental in the cybernetics discourse are also known to have been using LSD at the time, I imagine that they're part of a similar set of, if not, they certainly have conversations in common, whether they are, you know, one propels the other or not, a little more complicated.
Yeah. I was fascinated by something you said in your keynote, how the people who thought about cybernetics quite quickly agreed that technology wasn't neutral and that you could never just say it's just a technology. At the same time, I realized that that's exactly what, well, you know, speaking for myself as a layman here, exactly what we've been hearing for the last 20 years. It's just technology. It's not shaping anything. How did we lose that message? Or did we lose the message? Maybe a better question.
Well, so one of the things I find really interesting is when you go and look at the conversations about AI, and you look at that set of conversations in 1956, right? And the people that are in the room having that conversation, most of them had been involved in the decade-long cybernetics conversations that immediately preceded it. And yet, by the time you get to the Dartmouth conference, you're not talking about humans anymore, right? There's no human in the loop. It's about breaking down the human into small enough pieces that the machine can be made to do it. And I think there's something about that intellectual move that erases the idea of the complex system, that erases the idea of the human, that erases the idea of the ecological, because it's all really messy, and just says, no, we're going to work out how to make, you know, human thinking and the intellect into little tiny pieces, and we're going to be able to make a machine do it. And we're going to get rid of all that messy stuff, like the human thing, the people thing, the culture thing, because gosh, that's a mess. And I think when you do that, it is much easier to want to say, well, of course the technology is neutral because all it is building blocks. And these building blocks don't mean something. And I think that became a much more, convenience the wrong way of thinking about it, but I think there is this moment of attempting to erase what came before that conversation. I mean, you know, the AI research agenda is clearly in dialogue with and builds on cybernetics. Those conversations couldn't have happened in 56 without the ones that have gone on for 10 years before them. But I think there's a little bit of kill the daddies. We must kill the fathers in order to proceed. And so there's a sort of we're going to park all of that and move on. And then I think for many of the people that were the principal researchers and the funding bodies, it was in order to propel those things forward quickly, it was much easier to say that they weren't, that the technology, of course, didn't have any values. It was what you did with it. And I think for me, what's of course fascinating is that the earliest conversation about computing, every single time we knew it was about a value proposition, and not a value proposition in the economic sense, in a what is that technology being used for? It was really clear. And, you know, through, even as the AI agenda happens, there is a lot of cybernetics going on in the UK at the time, and also in places like Chile and Mexico and elsewhere in Europe. And I think those conversations thread those things a little bit more closely together.
Yeah. There's another question that came up. I'm just going to read it all out. It's by Eelco Herder, and he says, it seems that disruption in our use of technology usually start with the technological breakthrough of the launch of a new product system. Users and society then typically follow with gradual adoption and regulation. Are there any good examples of disruptions that were initiated by users or regulators?
Yeah, actually, interestingly, sorry, my hair is making me crazy. This would be pandemic hair, and it must immediately be braided out of my way.
I know exactly what you mean. Yes,
God,
take your time.
Thank you very much. It's such a good question. So I actually think one of the earliest examples has to do with the railway and the steam engine. So when the railway was first introduced in the United Kingdom, within 2 years of it being introduced, a series of pieces of regulation came along that changed the way people would engage with it completely. So the technology was there and it was going to scale, but the first set of innovations in the regulatory sense that completely changed the way people used the technology had to do, interestingly enough, not with safety, but with fare classes. So for the English, in order to have a railway system, if you imagined it was going to be everywhere, everyone had to have access to it. So they created a piece of legislation that mandated that you should have a fare structure such that you had tickets that anyone could buy. Even if you were really poor, you could buy a ticket. So they basically mandated that you can build this structure, but unless everyone can have access to it, we're not going to scale it out, right? And I think, you know, for me, that's an interesting one of sort of saying, actually there's a system that understood that people needed to use it and that needed to have access to it. And so there's one that's driven sort of from the regulatory end. For me, there's another one that is an interesting interplay between those things, because it's not one you often think about. Same technical system, so railways again, right? The disruption has to do with time. So again, in the United Kingdom and indeed across Western Europe, when the railways first came into being at scale, so we're talking the mid-1800s, time, whilst it was standard, was not standardly deployed. So time was local to a particular city. And while there were general time zones, they weren't always applied, right? And now if you need to make a railway run and share lines, you need to have standardized time. And in the UK, 40 years, train stations ran on train time, railway standard time it was called in England. And there's a reason why railway stations have clocks, right? Because they had their own time zone. And that clock was often not the same time zone as the one on the town hall. And so for 40 years in the UK and equally long in Germany and France, I confess I do not know about the Netherlands. I'm willing to bet you had this problem too. Was that basically the railways ran their own time and the rest of the world ran a different time. And it took an act of parliament in Britain to basically declare that railway time would become standard time. Same thing happened in Europe at various moments. And what ends up then happening for me is this sort of interesting thing of saying, if you had looked at a railway as a system and you looked at steam engines and rail lines and you thought to yourself, what is the likely consequence of that technical system? You would not have said to yourself, the likely consequence of that technical system is that we are going to standardize time. And so for me, there's something about how we take a longer view here. Now, these technologies move faster than the ones 150 years ago did, but in starting to imagine what will be the relationship between a technical system, a regulatory setting, a policy framework, and a human impulse, I think some of the ways these things unfold may look different than we expect. They're not always a straight line through.
When we're still in the 19th century with steam engines, I once heard you make a fascinating analogy on the steam engine in Britain and how the person who developed it might have made different choices had he known all the consequences. Because I remember you saying one of the consequences were that they chopped down all the wood, all the forests. Why is it so important for people to recognize the consequences of their technology?
Oh, absolutely. Well, because, yes, I often think that had someone said to James Watt, look, mate, this engine going to create a lot of problems. How are you going to think about it? He might have made different choices about optimizing that engine, right? I think it is sometimes really easy to get caught up with the immediate metrics of how the technical system unfolds without thinking about the social system and the broader system. And so there is a piece there about how do you roll back the conversation so that you are thinking more broadly cast about the whole framework. And so for me, there's a little bit about how do we help the moment where systems are being imagined to have a broader conversation about who is seen as the user of that system and who is in some ways, simultaneously rendered invisible or mute by that system. And how do we do a better job of seeing those things as they're unfolding? Because frankly, many of the people, the social groups, and the consequences of these technical systems are hardly new. I mean, you couldn't wake up one day and say, gosh, that technical system disenfranchises women. You're like, oh, well, in that case, it's different than every other system that ever came before it. Or, that system seems to structurally reinforce, divisions by class or race or ethnicity or religion. Well, okay, that's not exactly new either. So we actually have a very clear sense of the ways in which technical systems cleave along and reinforce lines of social inequity. So there are questions we should be able to ask a priori about some of those systems because we've seen it before.
Yeah, and one of the questions from the audience actually touches upon this. It's from Bart. He says, thanks for sharing. I was wondering if you could say a bit more on sorry, I'm cutting the question in half. I hope you see. I hope everybody can see it because it's a bit long. I was wondering if you could say a bit more on that and how it may help deprovincialize dominant AI histories for whom and what, and also what other alternative scenarios can be thought of. Do you have some nice examples? You recently stumbled upon?
Such a good question.
It is.
It's a lovely question. So one of the things we did when we first started building out our various, curriculums and the stories we wanted to tell was we went through an act of thinking about how did we decolonize and deprovincialize decolonize our curriculum, right? And it was as much about saying, how do we make sure that we are looking at different ways that information is conveyed? So how do we think about everything from blog posts and podcasts to movies and oral histories? It was also about how do we make sure that everything doesn't just come from the global north? How do we make sure that we're telling different kinds of stories? And how do we look in a different way at things? So, Bart, one of the things that has become a real touchstone for me is a set of Aboriginal fish weirs that exist here. So about 900 kilometres north from where I'm sitting in a town called, these days, Bawarrina on the Barwon River, there is a series of fish weirs. They're stone. They are shaped shaped like a U, and there's a series of them that run about a kilometre down the river, and they create a series of pens that can hold fish in basically cold, clear running water. And so what it lets you do is trap the fish as they go down the river, hold them alive in order to have a food supply to bring people to the banks of this river to gather for ceremony and for business. This system requires a couple of things, right? In order to make this work, you actually need to understand how lithics or stone function. So you need to fully understand the ways in which stone moves and stone sort of sits in those systems. You need to understand hydrology, how water moves. And we're talking about a part of the world where the water systems have a fairly high variation between drought and flood. You need to know about animals. You also need to have a social system that lets you manage who's responsible for looking after the fish, getting the fish, distributing the fish, who's responsible for saying, you don't get any fish, you get all the fish, or no fish for anyone. And, how do you look after that system generation on generation? So it's an incredibly sophisticated system, this set of fish weirs. According to archaeologists, there's a lot of debate about this, but that system is somewhere between 20 to 40,000 years old.
Wow.
The last time it was used was probably about 10 weeks ago, because it's been raining constantly for the last 10 weeks, and so the river is currently flooded and you cannot see the stone weirs. But when the river recedes again, people will go back to using that system. Yeah. And so for me, there's something about, and I think of it as a cybernetic system, right? Clearly it's a proto-cybernetic system. But there's something about how do we tell stories about systems that make clear, deep understanding, but a deep understanding embedded in place, and where the notion of what makes that system functional is curating it over multiple generations, and is the fact that what it does is sustain people in that place. And so there's something for me about how we get better at seeing those kind of technical systems and how we tell the stories about them. So, but I don't know if that's the answer you were hoping for, but that's the one that makes me the happiest at the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ms. Bell. This is what we have time for, and it's really late at your end of the world. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I hope you have a good night out of you. I, for one, will be following your work and what you do next. Thank you so much for your time here.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And for everybody watching, there is a short break, about 5 minutes, but after that, we'll be back with a panel debate on inclusion in the digital space. How do you get there in this digital space that we are now finding ourselves in? You can go back to the lobby, you'll see the program, and you can click on the panel that you want to attend. And one of those panels will be held here in the studio, and that will be with Jiska Engelbert, Shirley de Wit, and Joelle Zwart. So I hope to see you then.